making all of the recordings available to people
Okay.
on the club's YouTube channel.
Okay.
Some of the, there's been a range in, different speakers and talking about different things or whatever, but they're interesting. If you have absolutely nothing to do, I definitely recommend them. So
Okay.
tonight
I will
we're
try
going
to live up to that standard. So I will share my screen, and oh no, you have to let me share my screen.
Oh, okay. And before I do, I just want to, just introduce folks to Shabazz, even though I assume everybody is here because they read what I put out, which is that Shabazz is active as a bike advocate here in New York for years. And one of the things that I really find very distinctive about Shabazz and what he has to say, I hear it in like advisory groups or boards or what have you, but just on Twitter, Shabazz just has this eagle eye. He knows how to pick out exactly what is kind of interesting or like what's wrong with this picture sort of thing, and is good at posting them. They come through, and it really is like a great and unique perspective on what's been going on in our city during this pandemic. I've tried to bring as many voices as I can, distinctive voices to this space about what's going on with the city's transportation policy, what's going on with cycling during the pandemic, what's going wrong, the opportunities, some of which sometimes are being exploited with, more or less well. Shabaaz is a really important addition to that. And he's going to talk a little bit from his perspective, which I think is where he gets that eagle eye, working for the Business Improvement District in downtown Brooklyn, which is a very important organization that helps sort of manage streets. And I think it's where it's an important and interesting perspective on the city, as well as the founder and chief executive officer of Unipod, which I hope he'll tell us about. I know he's very modest about his business ventures, but he's more interested in talking policy with us and bicycling. But Unipod is a really great answer to the bike security issues that a lot of us have. Not without reason. We've all lost one or more bikes over the years. So it's a traumatic experience that you never really let go of. But Shabaaz has actually, come up with some solutions to try to deal with that in the urban context. So I'm just going to let him start sharing the screen. And why isn't it?
You have to make me the host.
So you don't have share screen abilities, you think?
No, it says the host has disabled screen share.
Okay.
So you can right click on my name and you can make me up.
I think that's what I did. I think I just upgraded you. Sorry for the delay.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen? Can you see me smiling?
Yes.
Okay. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is, as Steve mentioned, Shabazz Stewart. Let me just try to find it. This is kind of, okay, well, I'll figure that out later. I'm Shabazz Stewart. I want to say a few things before I really get going in the presentation. Foremost, I would encourage everyone to share their questions that we can address later in the Q&A period in the chat section as I'm going through the presentation. I'm going to speak a little bit about my background and about what I want to talk about with you all tonight. I was born and raised here in Brooklyn, and I never learned to drive. In fact, I always relied on public transportation as my primary means of getting around the city. I learned to bike really in a city in Boston in college, and I came back and brought that to New York. I, was a policy major in college and really went to post-grad here in New York and also focused in policy. And as Steve mentioned, I went to work early in my career for a business improvement district, eventually becoming the deputy director of operations. Now, as I became more advanced in my knowledge of getting around town by bike, I kept on having bikes stolen. In fact, I had 3 stolen in a period of 5 years. And it occurred to me while I was at the bid, if this is really ever going to be a cogent mode of transportation and not just something that's a novelty, you really have to think through all the elements and pieces of the ecosystem that need to be in place for people really to adopt this. And so the way I approached this work is not just as an advocate or an activist, but as someone who comes from mainly a policy perspective and wants to apply those best practices to the world of biking, particularly in New York. Steve mentioned Uni, and I know Uni is here displayed prominently, and that's, spoiler, that's because I used Uni letterhead for the presentation, because I don't have my own, but Uni is a product of that. It's something that, I don't really look at it as a business venture. I look at it as my way to be impactful in the landscape. Simply put, I think as advocates, it would behoove us to find ways to just go do stuff and to show government how it's done. So, after kind of going to the DOT and going to, City Bike and saying, hey, look, this is our cool idea. We had some renderings. We had, conceptually how it would work, and getting the door kind of politely closed in our face a number of times and said, we're just going to go do it ourselves. I would like to think that in another lifetime, I'd be working for government and doing this. I see as a kid who grew up riding transit and as someone who still loves transit, I see what I'm doing as just building infrastructure and building transportation systems that people can actually use. The only difference is, and this is largely a function of where we are in our society today, this has to be enshrined in a small business capitalist paradigm and can't really find a home in government, right? Can't find a home in an innovation department in the city or within a DOT. It has to be something that is a startup. But as I'll address later in the presentation, this really is a byproduct of a desire to build a transportation system that works for the city. So with that being said, I will get started here. Look, I think when we try to understand where we are with New York and bicycles, there's some really interesting top line trends. On the left, we have this 700% increase since the year 2000 that I think is really profound. And that sounds like a lot, and it's because it is a lot. So, in March, we were actually at 350%, but then it doubled again, right, during COVID. And so now, when you look at the number of bikes that are on the street today, compare that with the year 2000, you're talking about 700% more. And that's something that, I think if you had told Paul Stevie White, in the year 2005, when we started working at Transalt, that this is where we're going to be, I think we'd all be, I think hats would fall off. I think we're seeing a shift in how people are riding. We're seeing e-bikes start to become an increasingly larger share of the market. E-bike sales are up 190% since 2019, so that's just in the course of a year. And we're also seeing the city spend a lot more in the way of resources on bicycle lanes. So in 2007, we had about 119 bicycle lanes. Now we have 1,250. There's obviously a long way to go, and these bicycle lanes, as you'll hear my thoughts later on, are rather imperfect, but it's still a monumental shift from where we were 20 years ago. And I think it lays the foundation for where we can be. Now, when we start to think about the problems that we have as a cycling ecosystem, it's really would behoove us to compare it to other forms of transit. So with cars, I don't have a driver's license, but I do find myself often a passenger. With cars, we have this really robust, quite intentional ecosystem that has been built out to allow people to drive around cities. So we have affordable leasing and rental options. We have highly distributed sales channels for both sales and service. If you think about the car dealerships, think about, I think 1 out of every 3 commercials on TV is a car commercial. You have license plates and registration that are state sponsored with the DMV. You have a pre-owned vehicle market. You have insurance companies that provide, that guard against damage and loss. You have parking everywhere. So New York City has about 3.5 to 4 million free parking spaces on street. We have parking minimums in buildings. When you build a new building in New York, by default, you're required to basically provide 0.3 to 0.5 parking spaces per new unit of housing. We have an extensive and convenient refueling network. So gas stations, even today, dot the city. So if you're driving your car, usually only a mile away from the nearest gas station. And most importantly, I think we've got safe, dedicated streets for cars. So streets have been optimized largely to be conducive to driving fast safely. If you've been to the West Side Highway or Lexington Avenue or Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, you see 3-ton vehicles, 5-ton vehicles, 10-ton vehicles going pretty fast and doing so rather safely. So great for the cars, those streets are, but not so great for everyone else. The result is, even in New York City, 27% of citizens commute via automobile. So we are at about 1/3 mode share in New York City, which is pretty impressive given that most people in New York City don't actually own a car. About 50% don't own a car. And that's because, again, of this kind of robust ecosystem that makes it really conducive to getting around by vehicle. But even looking at transit, we've got a very similar kind of ecosystem present. So in New York City, you have 472 subway stations. That's not including the path. We've got 270 commuter rail stations. Subways, have relatively frequent service. You've got a nomenclature and presence that is relatively ubiquitous. You go to a local bodega. You go to a service center for New York City Information Center, KTS booth. It's usually very easy to get a subway map. Everyone seems to know how to get around in the subway, and the subway system, by and by, complaints notwithstanding, seems to be relatively easy to navigate. There are help points and even apps that are created just to help people understand how to get around and how to pay, etc. So if you go on Google Maps, for example, there is you can get the live results of when your train is about to come, when it's approaching, etc. And that just goes to show you that this is something that's relatively hegemonic in our experience as New Yorkers, excuse me. And also equally as importantly, like the system that we have in place today, especially on the commuter rail side, is quite integrated with the motor vehicular economy. So we've got these parking garages that you can drive up to, park your car, vehicle, and you can get on a commuter rail train, LIRR, Intertransit, or Metro North, and you can continue your journey. And the result is we have 6 million plus riders a day in the metropolitan area. It's the highest in North America, and it's no coincidence that we have this relatively robust transit network in New York City that facilitates all of that. So for cyclists, this experience is fractured, and it's unreliable and inconvenient. And that's a theme I'm going to return to again and again and again, because I think too often we think only in the context of safety. We don't really think about something as reliable and convenient. No one drives their car, for example, and says, oh, great, it was really safe today. They say the traffic was terrible it was inconvenient. No one rides the subway and says, wonderful, I got to my destination really safely in one piece. They say it was slow, the train was late, it was smelly, it was loud. And so we have to apply that same manner of thinking, that same paradigm, when we think about people using bikes. And so there's a bevy of kind of elements that are really inconducive to people really using bikes as a primary mode of navigating a city. So we've got no interconnected network with transit options. I'll get to this in a second, but you know, right now it's really hard to use a bike or a scooter and to actually plug it into the transit system. We've got a really incomplete network of cycling lanes. And the ones that we have that exist only offer really cosmetic or aesthetic protection from vehicles. It's very frightening for people who are new to riding a bike for the first time. We have no convenient options for bike parking. Very few buildings offer convenient storage options. And there's really no way to navigate the Byzantine system that we have so you can identify the ones that exist in terms of parking and storage. In terms of how you actually get your bike fixed and repaired, that landscape is relatively Byzantine as well. And I'll get into each of these in a second. So when we think about mobility and safety, you know, look, let's talk about transit connectivity first. New York City is actually, you know, far behind its peers in how we integrate cycling with transit. And considering that New York City has by far the highest mode share of transit in North America, it's really a disservice to people who bike and people who would like to use bikes to get around. So for example, we are the only big city in the country where there are no bike racks on the buses. You can go to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston. You will always find bike racks and buses. Here in New York City, the MTA is just starting to experiment with bike racks and buses in Staten Island. It's a clear, it's a clear placating move, something that the transit agency isn't really interested in. But think about the implications of that. Let's say you're biking down the street and it starts pouring rain, and you decide that you want to take a bus to finish your journey. Well, you can't do that in New York. In New York, you're out of luck, right? You are going to have to haul your bike on the subway. We don't really have escalators and elevators everywhere, or you're going to have to bike in the rain. You can see here in this photo, we don't really have a network of bicycle routes. We've got some bicycle lanes, but the bicycle lanes we have are largely suboptimal. Here in this photo, which I actually shot this weekend, you have a green lane. This is one of New York's quote unquote more protected lanes because it's actually right up against the curb. There's no parked cars. But without actually,
Shabazz, we're not seeing your photo. I just want to let you.
You can't see my photo in the presentation here.
Oh, the black and white photo. That's yours.
Yeah, on the side. So I'll use my mouse to point. You know, you've got a green lane here. And a car can just park right in, all right? And you've got the cyclist here on the side. We're gonna have to navigate into traffic around the vehicle. That's par of the course for most of New York's protected lanes. And the routes that exist, the ones that are protected, are often dangerous and inconvenient. I'm gonna talk about what it means to be inconvenient for a second. When you think about New York's top tier premium streets for retail, Fifth Avenue, Broadway, Fulton Street in Brooklyn, Flatbush Avenue, Brooklyn, very few of them are actually cycling destinations. So New York has this tendency to place cycling facilities, cycling routes, especially in the so-called outer boroughs, on secondary or even tertiary streets. So living in Crown Heights, you know, where Fulton Street is the main sort of like shopping destination, the cycling routes are located on Dean, Bergen, on Willoughby and DeKalb. And that's I suppose good from a DOT perspective because you don't have to really get rid of the parked cars or get rid of traffic. But you know, many of the cyclists would rather be closer to the destinations, which almost always are on the primary corridors. And so you see people actually biking down Nostrand, biking down Fulton, biking down Flatbush with very, very limited protection. I will say that Broadway is a really prime example of what can happen when a city looks at a main corridor and decides to allocate a lot of that street space for walking and for biking. You can see that even though there are a lot of primary destinations on Broadway, people can bike down it, and it's actually something that people often choose to do. That's the exception that proves the rule in New York. Cycling connectivity just isn't considered a top priority here in New York City, and as a result, you don't see cycling crack that top tier of transit. So a classic example of what I mean by that is when you ride the subway, you see that subway map, do you see city bike stations labeled at subway stops? Do you see cycling corridors or key cycling facilities labeled at subway stops? No, that's actually the exception. You look at other great cycling cities like London and Paris and Amsterdam, that's an exception. If we want to get to a cycling sort of mecca where people are relying on bikes to get around, that's something that we have to really address. We don't really have a parking or storage system that is comprehensive at all. So something that people don't really realize, bicycle theft is only one of the many suboptimal byproducts that exist from the lack of parking, but it's perhaps the most pervasive and the most traumatic. Over half of all urban cyclists experience bike theft, and that comes from a study that was done in Montreal. When you realize and you apply that to New York, it means about 75,000 stolen bikes annually. So 7% of people who experience bike theft don't replace their bikes. You can imagine what that really means. It means you're taking maybe 3 steps forward and 1 step backwards every year. People, they buy a new bike, they, love their bike, they are kind of afraid of getting their bike stolen, and they get their bike stolen, and it's this demoralizing, awful experience. And for a lot of New Yorkers, they may not return to a bike again for a few years. And so as a result, people are largely opting to gravitate towards other modes of transit. As we start to see, I know this is the bike club, but it's important to acknowledge other micromobility form factors. As we start to see one wheels, scooters, trikes become more prevalent, the issue of clutter on the streetscape and the issue of actually how we organize street space is going to be even more prevalent. In other cities, there's pictures from LA where you've got dockless scooters, you have a lot of the same problem. You don't have any on-street space allocated towards parking and organizing bikes and scooters. And so when you walk down a lot of major streets in New York, you see these skeletons, like on the right, on the left here. You see these bike carcasses, right? Where each one of those represents usually someone who's had their dreams crushed and has most likely exited the mode for a period of time. Now, when it comes to thinking about a key part of the experience, you have to think about what happens when your bike needs service or repair. Most new adopters to the world of cycling are not road warriors who know how to fix their bike, right? I speak to you as someone who wouldn't trust, I wouldn't trust myself to fix my chair, let alone my bike. So when my bike behaves badly, the first place I go is my local bike shop. And, we've had a trend in New York for many years where bike shops have been closing. And that's largely a result of the retail crisis, where rents have been going up and up. But it's also the result of, I think just the city of New York, and I'll get this in a little bit later in the presentation, just not finding a way to support bike shops, not realizing that bike shops are a really key part of the experience. And so today, when we've seen this doubling in the number of bikes in the street, we have these long lines for the bike shop. This is Vanderbilt Avenue Bike Habitat, and this is part of the course. And so think about what happens if you are a rider and you're in a hurry. You got to wait in a long line just to get your bike even seen. So think about the implications for people who get in crashes, or people who need to get their bike working for tomorrow, what they're going to do. I will say that as people gravitate more towards e-bikes and scooters, the support ecosystem is even less. So many bike shops refuse to service e-bikes and e-scooters. They fix gears, they don't fix motors. And so adopters are finding that There is no cogent ecosystem that exists. They're on their own. They've got to, haul their heavy e-bike to a service center, maybe one of a handful that exists in the city. And that might take days or weeks. That has really profound implications for how people choose to rely on their bikes. And I'm going to, hammer this home again and again and again. We have to get to a place where using a bike or scooter is convenient and reliable, ideally more so than using a car. I will close on this slide by saying that our network of bike shops was built for a bygone era where bikes were mostly recreational. So this idea that you're going to walk into a bike shop and they're going to maybe tune up your bike in a few days is really built on the notion that your bike is an amenity. It's something that you can use if you'd like to, but not something you really need. You need your bike for tomorrow's race. You don't need your bike to get to work. I'm going to talk about that idea for a second, an amenity versus utility and the implications that it has for how, as policymakers, we think about bikes. I found it to be rather pervasive in the world of policy in New York City that people, when they think of a cyclist, they think of, usually an affluent person who's white who rides their bike to work because they want to get some exercise, or maybe they want to see the city, or maybe it's just the novelty of it all, right? And they're usually riding either an expensive or more expensive personally owned bike, or they're riding on bike share. But there's a whole group of people here in New York who actually ride not because they want to, or not because it's something that is going to get them exercise, but because they have to. And those people are largely left out of the conversation, even though they account for what is likely a majority of mode share. So here in this picture, you have a delivery cyclist. There are 50,000 working cyclists in New York City, a large percentage of whom work for restaurants, delivering food. The DOT cycling in the city report doesn't even include pictures of them because the city for many years confiscated their e-bikes. We've got an increasing number of mostly minority young men who are delivering for services like Grubhub and Seamless and DoorDash and Postmates. And those are people who, again, are working because cycling is a means for economic success, a means for a job. They're essential workers, quote unquote, not because it's something that is an elective. And you've got folks who are just in communities of color, period, who use bikes as a means to get around. So the League of American Cyclists found that poor Americans in general were more likely to bike for transportation, and immigrants were the most likely to bike for transportation. I think understanding that we are not just designing a system for people who can choose to bike but may have other options. Instead, we're designing a system for people who need to bike is very, very critical. We want to have a system of infrastructure that's in place that allows you to get around because you absolutely need to use your bike to get from point A to point B. And you think about that for a second and think about cars. If you had a highway and the city said, sorry, we're closing the highway down today, it'll be open, a few weeks from now, there would be an uproar, right? We're just repaving it.
Like the Hudson River bike path, just within last month, where the city announced they were shutting it down for Cherry Walk, and then they didn't do it, and then they shut down a different part for which there was no notice.
And the city, that's a great point. And because the city, again, I was thinking about milling roads, but that's a very astute point. The city shuts down bike lanes without notice. Roads are milled without notice, making them largely impassable. So imagine if that were done for transit. If the city said, hey, how are you? Today, the 8th Avenue line is just closed. And it'll open up when we feel like it. Can you imagine? That would be unacceptable. It's unimaginable. But that's the system we have for cyclists. And it's largely because we're viewing cycling as this amenity where if bike lanes are closed, if bike shops are closed, then the idea is that there are other ways that people can get around, and they're going to choose those other ways because they don't really need to bike in the first place. And if we continue to have that mode of thinking, we're never going to get to 25 to 30% mode share. So these burning questions are the ones I often pose to policymakers, right? Just to hammer home this point of let's think of cycling as something where we need to plan for the entire experience, not just for safety or not just for getting to a few places. So what do you do if you buy a $1,000 bicycle and you have no place to park it? Where does that live? Are you going to ride your bicycle that costs $1,000 and leave it on the street? Probably not. Now let's imagine it's a $2,000 e-bike or a $3,000 e-bike. You're going to say, I have my nice new bike, but I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel safe riding it around the city because it's going to get stolen from me. That's a very, very common complaint that we hear. What happened? Who do you call? And present company notwithstanding, Steve, but who do you call if you've been in a bike crash, right? If you're in a car crash, you call AAA. They come and they take care of you. They're the pros. If you're in a bike crash, what do you do? Who do you call? Right? What's the protocol? Now, I imagine for a cyclist who's been hardened by the streets of New York, that might seem like an odd question. But for a new cyclist who is used to perhaps a more concierge-like experience, what do you do? Who do you call? Is there a bicycle equivalent of AAA? What do you do? If you get a flat tire at the Manhattan Bridge at 3 a.m., what do you do? Do you do you drag your bicycle home? Do you call a cab and hope that they can fit your bicycle inside? Now, today, remember, the subway shut down at 1. So what are you really going to do now? The buses don't have bicycle racks, so you're on your own. And who do you call when your e-bike breaks down? You can fix by tomorrow. That might seem like an odd scenario, but it's a scenario that lots of working cyclists face every day. If your primary means of livelihood is using your e-bike to make food deliveries and you need your e-bike fixed, who do you call? What do you do? What happens if you need to bring a bike on the bus and you can't? What do you do with that bike? Where does it go? And lastly, can you afford to use a bike in New York? If you go to a bike shop and you say, look, the cost of fixing this bike that you need is $125, and you make minimum wage or below, as do a significant percentage of New Yorkers, what are you going to do? Is cycling not for you? Now, mind you, when we think about this, this last question here, you might say, look, I think riding a bike in New York is actually pretty cheap. And you'd be right. But when you think about public transit, the unlimited Metro card is basically a payment plan for using the subway. We've created ways to bring down the cost of riding public transit that we just simply haven't applied to cycling as an ecosystem. And so as a result, for many people who live paycheck to paycheck, which again, we're talking about roughly a third of New York City, cycling and riding a bike that actually works remains a pretty daunting task. So I'm going to talk for a bit about two cities, LA and London, and some interesting lessons that we can learn. I think as New Yorkers, we kind of regard LA as a public transit desert and like a largely primitive society that's in the medieval age. But it may surprise folks to learn that LA, like most cities on the West Coast, is light years ahead of New York in thinking through cycling infrastructure and the cycling experience as a whole. So LA Metro, which is that city's subway system, and they're paired with their city's DOT, has about 10 of these what we call bike hubs. And those bike hubs are near some of their major transportation destinations, Union Station, Hollywood and Vine, et cetera. And they are basically marquee facilities that are being constructed on the dollar of public transit, and they provide bike parking, but they also provide bike service, bike maintenance, bike rentals, and bike sales. And that might seem, in the context of New York, to be unbelievable, but yeah, in transit facilities at key stations, they've got these massive sort of stores where you can park your bike for free with a tap card, which is their Metro card. You can buy a bike, rent a bike, you can get your bike tuned up and repaired. And they're expanding the program. It's considered kind of a no-brainer for them. San Francisco also has a more nascent bike hub program. And other cities like DC and Chicago have a few facilities as well. New York has none of these facilities. They don't exist. But bike lockers are plentiful throughout the LA Metro network. So at most LA Metro subway stations, there are at least bike lockers where you can go leave your bike and ride the subway for a fee. We actually spent with Uni some time working with LA Metro And they, when thinking about working with them in a partnership, they kind of told us that it's standard. All their new transit facilities, they're building 2 new subway lines, are going to have bike parking built into the stations. And they kind of were like, well, duh, how are people going to park their bikes? In that context, New York is ages behind. In London, and I apologize for the low resolution photos, in London, they've tackled what we call dispersed bike parking with bike hangars. So you can see here on the left, you've got a network of these cycle hangars that are on residential streets. And that's largely born out of the realization that London has pretty old housing stock and people can't lug their bikes up to the top floor. So you may have bike storage available in your apartment, but it may not be convenient. It may not be easy to use. So you can, in London, you can, in some boroughs, access relatively cheap. It's like £3, £4 a month on-street bike parking. Now, here's the thing. London has about 6,000 of these and announced another 8,000. So we're actually talking about a pretty robust on-street, basically protected bike corral network, that allows people to kind of, for a small price, come in and use these structures and protect their bikes. There's some drawbacks. These aren't smart, so they're only operate through lock and key. That means that if someone perhaps goes away for a holiday and they take their bike with them, this is underused space, but it's still light years ahead of what we have in New York. London has a comprehensive plan for routes. So they call it the cycle superhighway network, but you can see here the way that's envisioned, this is it's a conceptualization of what a network of cycling routes would look like if it were a highway system or public transit system. So they all lead into London Center, city center, and they go to corners of the city. So, if you're in London, you know that you're close to Route A Route 8 or 9 or 10, and you know that Route 10 takes you towards the city center. You know that Route 11 connects to Route 9. You can just go from Route 9 to Route 11 back out to the periphery of the city. And that's something that everyone knows. It's something that we don't have in New York, but it's really critical to helping the public conceptualize cycling as something that is reliable. So I'm going to talk about our own project for a second, Uni. No, it's actually not Unipod. It's Uni. It's something that we've been fighting this battle for many years. But the idea behind Uni was to create cycling infrastructure that provided both parking and service, and to incorporate some of the practices that we learned at the Business Improvement District and based on what we see with bus shelters and newsstands and Lincoln YC. So, New York City actually has a pretty robust network of on-street furniture for what are accepted traditional uses of street space. So newsstands and bus shelters are accepted traditional uses of street space. And so it's pretty standard that we would expect that we would see copious amounts of street space allocated to those uses. We've got 3,500 bus shelters and about 400 newsstands. So the question occurred to me in 2016, if we've got 3,500 bus shelters across New York City, we've got 1,700 Lincoln YCs, we've got 750 city bike stations, we've got 400 newsstands, then how come we don't have bicycle stations? Surely at least 150 bicycle stations in a public network isn't too much to ask for. So what are the challenges that we normally see when we think about bike parking stations? Well, how do they look? What's the design? Who's maintaining them? How are you paying for them? So we set out to kind of solve all of those challenges and to at first pitch it to DOT, to some other actors, and then when they didn't go for it, do it ourselves and to show the city that it could work. It was not an easy task. My partner is an architect, and we had to think through both a design kind of perspective, how this would look, how this would operate in the streetscape, but also how it would, from a technological perspective, how it would be automated. It has to be automated because economically speaking, there's just no way to really make this facility affordable if you're paying someone $15 an hour to sit down, sit downstairs and open the gate, close the gate. And then of course, you have to close it up at night. Our facilities are free to the public. So there was definitely no way to do that if it weren't automated. So we had to really think through all the tech that would go inside. So everything from video camera monitoring to a door that would close automatically. If not, then the entire facility's point is moot. Having that pod be self-leveling so that it could actually be built as like a pop-up on a wide variety of surfaces. Most streets in New York are actually pitched. There's basically no flat surface in New York City streets. How it would be illuminated at night so people felt safe going in. We had to allow people to see in, outside in, inside out, because you had to think through, you know, how do you prevent illicit activity? How do you make sure that people, for lack of a better word, people aren't going to be murdered inside, as we get asked a lot. How is this thing going to be powered? So do we have solar panels? Do we have, is it going to be plugged into the grid? What's that system going to look like? And what's the access control experience going to look like? So what you have in front of you is a pod that looks relatively simple, but there are about 265 different innovation points that we spent about 2 years trying to refine. And this is pretty much a prototype. You know, our vision is a lot more holistic and expansive, but it's a starting point. The pods are modular, so they can be expanded in different dimensions. So let's say that we've got a double-sided pod that could probably hold 40 bikes, but if we could expand it out to hold 60 bikes, our smaller one could hold 20 bikes. And the idea is that no one public space is like another public space. So you may have under the FDR enough space for 150 bikes. And in a public plaza in downtown Manhattan, maybe you have enough space for 20 bikes. You're going to need the ability to have different cladding options. Maybe you have different greenery. Maybe you have different types of decor, because what's appropriate for Times Square may not be appropriate for the Hudson Yards, right? I think property owners here in New York City, rightfully so, are very sensitive about the aesthetic they're trying to produce. And you have to make your bike parking infrastructure, if it's going to be successful and viable, conform to the dynamic of the streetscape. Now, when we're thinking through the value proposition we would offer to not just the city, but to the property owners of the city, installation became very important. So the idea that this was not permanent infrastructure, it was more of a pop-up piece of infrastructure, and it could be installed and set up in 24 hours and also taken down in 24 hours was also pretty key. Uni comes in a moving truck, and so it gets assembled on site. It's not necessarily akin to a bus shelter in that regard, where it's not a unibody piece of infrastructure. It's probably more akin to 150 Lego pieces that are assembled on site. So, you know, the idea of service is very important to us. We haven't iterated this out yet. We haven't introduced this to the public, but we would like, our vision for the future is to have a network of pods in and around a city like New York, and allow users to lock their bikes in locks that are smart. So they can open and close in connection with the overall system. So you wouldn't carry your own lock, you'd lock the bike on one of our smart racks. And you could use your app to schedule someone to come repair your bike while it's sitting in the pod, while you're at work, while you're at home. And the idea is that we find a relatively streamlined way to integrate both parking and service. And that's important because when you look at what the future has to resemble in order to get us to 25 to 40% mode share, we really need to find opportunities to increase service capacity. Right now, we're seeing lots of strain at 2% mode share, where bike shops can't handle the influx of customers. And I think it's naive to think we're going to see bike shops return the way they were before. As long as rental prices stay high, without a subsidy, I think we're locked in. We need to have other means, whether it be home delivery, which is relatively expensive, or using on-street pods to provide bicycle repair services, emergency repairs, and even tune-ups to folks who are parked inside. And that's really important for us because I think when we look at this from a business perspective, we see this as one of the most scalable opportunities that allows us to make this free to the city and also free to the user. I will say the pods themselves have advertising on the side. They operate in a very similar, straightforward business proposition that bus shelters do, that Lincoln YC does. You know, our message to the city is, you know, bike infrastructure, until City Bike came along, really has not traditionally been part of this protected class of infrastructure that is allowed to tap into streetscape advertising, but it should be. If we are serious about getting bikes to 30% mode share, then we have to find an alternate source of financing to pay for the infrastructure. Public transit, you have advertising. Newsstands, you have advertising. City Bike, you have advertising. And in each of those cases, advertising provides a pretty significant share of revenue to that underlying service. So for public transit, as high as 6%. For City Bike, as high as 80%. And for Lincoln YC, for high quality waste receptacles and the big bellies, those programs simply wouldn't be possible if it weren't for some sort of advertising arrangement. And we hope to kind of replicate the same here. So I'm going to go in order and talk about our proof of concepts to date. I'm going to go from our most recent to our least recent. You're looking at the Barclays Center in downtown Brooklyn. This was launched almost a year ago, in December of 2019. This is our most advanced station to date. It's the last of our pilot locations. You know, I think when you look at this picture, you know, what I hope comes, you know, is driven home is our commitment to making each of these pods look good, and each of these pods, you know, not just be an eyesore on the street. So we actually, you know, we have a rule that 40% at least of the pod is going to be transparent, and that allows people to see outside in and inside out. And we know that's important because, especially at night, you want people to feel comfortable using this. So you can see there's a gentleman here fixing his bike. He's a working cyclist. He actually works in the day, and then he comes and charges his bike at night, and he does some repairs. But you can see him in there, and that's important. He can see me outside. We have the space between the main building and the pod itself. And the concern that we had initially was this was going to be, you know, kind of a scary, daunting space for people to traverse, even though a lot of pedestrians were going to really choose this as their primary means of walking by the pod. So we very intentionally made this side transparent. You can actually look outside in and inside out during the nighttime, and it creates a kind of open environment that's really conducive to pedestrian access. And then we installed auxiliary lights, excuse me, at the bottom of the pod to illuminate this passageway. And that, again, drives home our commitment to making these spaces attractive and interesting and nice. This particular pod is our most advanced. It is a DOB building. We went through the buildings process. So it's something that has been reviewed by architects, is compliant with snow, wind, rain, car impact, and also seismic. We have a direct power connection to the building. So you can see the strip here actually is a power conduit that allows us to access power 24/7, 365. And we did that because we have charging ports both on the inside and outside. So we have USB charging ports for the public to use on the outside, and we have charging ports for bikes on the inside, and that wouldn't be possible with solar panels. This was a hit with the community at launch. We got to date about 300, well, now we have about 400 signups. And it's a very popular amenity for the folks who are going to the mall but want to perhaps visit the mall on a nicer bike, and for working cyclists who use this as a base of operations for their work in downtown Brooklyn, Fort Greene, Park Slope. They park their bikes here overnight and take them out during the day. And so it's been really popular with the community. And actually the property owner, you know, is also deeply enamored with it as well, which is what we seek to do, make everyone happy. We have a partnership, which we're in the process of expanding on with the Port Authority. Our installation with them is a little more than a year old. We provide free bike parking to one of the largest transportation hubs in the system. And, I will say that I think the Port Authority folks were skeptical that this could work. The feeling was that Journal Square was not downtown Manhattan or downtown Brooklyn, and it was, a more challenging urban environment. And a large part of our thesis from a design standpoint is that if you care for something and if you design something well, then people will respect it. And you can see that at play with these nice classy bus shelters. Steve, I think you remember those old ugly bus shelters we used to have. The thesis was, hey, even in the toughest neighborhood, if you make a nice looking bus shelter, people are going to treat it nicely. And we've seen that bear out here in Journal Square. I can say to date, we've had no vandalism. It's been over a year. No one has even drawn graffiti on this pod. We've actually, in about 2.5 years of pilot operations, we've only had one incident of graffiti total. And so I think that would strike a lot of people as kind of unusual for New York, New Jersey. But again, I think it holds true what we know about how streetscapes work and how things are cared for. I think in terms of community engagement, we're probably most proud of this location because Journal Square, folks are very passionate, very loyal, and to their community. And there were a lot of questions. In the Port Authority, this is on Port Authority property. They just didn't really have to engage folks, so we went out and did it for them. We got a lot of questions on Twitter about why it was in the sidewalk, what it was going to be used for. And we took a lot of pride, and we went out and we actually answered those questions. We went to community hearings, we went to people's offices. And at the launch event, there were no less than 25 members of the community who came out to cheer the song. And some of our biggest fans were initially quite skeptical, but we were able to explain proactively what we were trying to do and why this pilot was worth giving a shot. We found that, look, even with bike infrastructure, one of the things that holds true is that people aren't usually opposed to it. What they're opposed to is the process of how it gets built, right? You can't, people want to feel like they're included in the process. They want to feel like the process is inclusive and it's something that you're not just telling them what's going to happen, you're asking them for their input. And when you do it, when you engage a community in a proactive manner, you often find that people are more than willing to give things a shot. So this was our first proof of concept. It was in downtown Manhattan. Was active for a period of 9 months. This was, I think, this was the big experiment. We were working in partnership with the Alliance for Downtown New York, which is a local bid, and they waited by the phone because they weren't sure if how the community would react. And the community board eventually called them up and said, this is probably 2 or 3 months in, and said, why aren't there more of them? What's the holdup? So, here in New York, that's when people are complaining they're moving too slow to roll something out, that's usually the ultimate sign of praise. And I will say that this is when we first realized how egalitarian this infrastructure could be. System-wide, in all 3 of our deployments, 65% of our users are non-white, 50% of our users are below area median income. That's important because when you look at bike share systems, Lime releases their stats for bike share and for scooter share. 17% of their user base are Black and Latinx, even though they operate in communities like DC and LA and Austin that are overwhelmingly Black and brown. In the Capital Bike Share system in Washington, DC, 5% are Black and of the users are Black, even though the city itself is 50% Black. So when we think about rolling out this kind of infrastructure and making it available to everyone, what this has to do from a policy perspective is if you design it right and you you set it at a price point that is interesting and attractive, you're going to see what is really a reflection of what Bike NYC actually looks like. And that's something that we've been very excited about, and it's been true to who we are ever since. You know, when we started the journey, we were operating in mostly obscurity. So at Atlantic Terminal, it was really the ultimate sign of triumph that politicians showed up to cut the ribbon, right? And you know, it really validates our perspective that that if you design something and operate something competently, if you make it accessible to everyone, if you are really thoughtful in how you integrate features, you know, and you listen to the community, then infrastructure can work and it can scale and it can metastasize in a manner that makes everyone happy. You know, one of the things I'm most proud of with Uni is that everyone's happy, it seems, right? Everyone seems to generally like it, and you're able to cultivate a reputation for really working with all sides to create something that isn't just tolerated but embraced. Now, I don't want to talk about Uni exclusively. I want to talk about some policy ideas for how we get cycling to 25 and 30% mode share, given what we've just discussed. So, you know, going for the network on down, we need a full integration with mass transit. One of the challenges we have here in New York is that we have a pretty fractured local economy when it comes to transportation planning. So we've got the Port Authority with PATH, NJ Transit. On the Jersey side, we've got the MTA, which of course is state run. We've got the DOT, which is city run. But what we really need is a plan for how we're going to transition mass transit riders to bikes and vice versa, because often they are the same. So that means secure bike parking at subway stations. It means having bike racks on bus shelters. It means having a plan for how people can carry their bikes into the subway. It means allowing people who are on bikes perhaps to understand, on cycling routes where transportation bus stops and subway stops are, right? Having those demarcated. And it means when we create a cycling system in New York City that's actually a network of interconnected routes, having that marketed or demarcated on a subway map. So you can see where the high quality cycling facilities are. So there can be a feeling of integration, which is so key. When we think about what a connected network of tiered cycling routes actually means, it means, when you look at cars, you have highways, arterials, and avenues. And so we need to think about bikes in the same manner. In driving a car, you wouldn't imagine driving a car on the highway and then suddenly it just turns into an avenue. That wouldn't really make a lot of sense, because what we have in New York City, where you're biking down, I think on the Brooklyn side of the Manhattan Bridge, I've been fascinated by this for many years. You're biking over the Manhattan Bridge. Not so bad, kind of narrow, but kind of okay. Then you kind of get onto the street, you get down to Navy Street, and you turn onto Flushing, and you're caught in this kind of weird mixing zone, which kind of seems like a maelstrom, a no man's land. You're kind of coming off what is a mini bike highway, and you're going onto this kind of car highway, and in a real, it's absurd. In a real convenient cycling economy, that wouldn't happen. We would have safe ways and convenient ways for people to get from point A to point B on the route. And we would have, premium highways that have special design components. Think about lighting, trees, special bike signs for to stop and to go. That would directly connect to what we would call arterials and avenues that are secondary and tertiary sort of connecting branches that would allow people to continue on their journeys. Right now, what we have is basically a haphazard soup that is built for people who are kind of tinkering around riding a bicycle, not serious journeys. Thinking about parking and storage, a citywide bike parking system. We are so far away from what London and Paris and even LA are doing. But a public bike parking system where we think about, not 1 or 2 or 15, but thousands of bike parking spaces that are dispersed across the city that are priced affordable for the public to use, that is a complement to in-building parking facilities that are private. So the easiest way to do that would be to have the DOT issue an RFP like they do for bus shelters and newsstands for bike parking. A citywide franchise, which could be financed through advertising, the same that Lincoln NYC is, would be revenue neutral at worst, revenue positive at best, and would be relatively affordable for the public, if not free. More stringent requirements for workplaces and residences. So in 2009, the city planning spearheaded what we call Bikes and Buildings. And Bikes and Buildings is a package of zoning incentives that basically, or zoning requirements, I should say, that basically compel workplaces, new residences, and parking garages and parking lots to have bike parking. And it's largely ineffective. Here's why. Because the city, you can't compel people to do many things in New York, especially if they're big businesses. They almost always find a way around it. Usually you have to package in incentives, or you have to explain to them why it's in their interest to do it. So in the case of workplaces, workplaces in New York are required to have a bike plan. And if they don't, then they can be tattled on, by an employee. So there goes your pain point number one. Employees usually don't have the time or the patience to file a complaint with the Department of Transportation, about their workplace. They're most often going to either choose to park their bike outside or just leave their bike at home. So we have to take that away, and we have to ensure that the DOT has some sort of mechanism to inspect or to quality assure their process that doesn't require a third-party worker. But also, look, even the workplaces that do provide secure bike parking often make it so Byzantine and laborious that you might as well not provide it at all. So one story that comes from one of our UNI partners is a relatively high net worth individual. He has his own office in the building, and they say, look, you got to park it downstairs in the basement, right? You have to come in through the cargo elevator. And if your bike is downstairs after 4 p.m. and the cargo elevator shuts down, the freight elevator shuts down, then we throw your bike away. So, the not so subtle message is, yes, we check the box, but it's so inconvenient that you might as well not do it. And so in order for us to get to a place where workplaces and residences have convenient, secure bike parking, we have to have some really strong requirements that dictate not just the quantity, but the quality. And we also have to have perhaps some tax inducements to reward people who create grade A, tier 1 bike parking facilities. Garages are a different story. I think, I think people often look at garages and say, wow, we have garages and parking cars. Why can't they park bikes? The garages hate it. So when they were required to provide bike parking, they did, but they raised the price accordingly. So you can go to Midtown and see a garage that says $500 for the month. And that's because the garages usually don't want their attendants parking bikes, and they don't want people walking around their garage with bikes. And the cyclists hate it too. Cyclists really hate the idea of navigating this really, underground maze of dark, parking garages. But the thieves love it, because a thief can go into a parking garage, sneak in, and clip a bike relatively easily, and it's actually much more private than on the street. So if you want garages to do it right, you're going to have to get them to provide good, secure bike parking facilities closer to the entrance. And that's going to require tax inducements as well. It's going to require the city to explain to these garages why they should take their time to provide the service. I think tax incentives for vacant properties to provide bike parking is also a smart idea. So I get asked a lot about vacant storefronts. Why can't we use vacant storefronts? Well, the truth of the matter is about vacant storefronts is, if you go to a storefront and say, hey, I want to rent your property. They may give you a lease for a year, but they're not going to give you a lease for 5 years. And if you're being asked to invest a lot to optimize the space for bike parking, to bring an attendant and a staff member, it's just not going to pencil out in a year. There's a service called Bike Drop in London, which uses the storefront retail model. They provide bike parking. It's £6 a day. It's £1,200 a year to park your bike. And again, that's in pounds. So it's probably about 35% more in dollars. Don't think that's viable or ethical here in New York City. You need a way to produce this amenity, this utility, I should say, that is more cost effective and more egalitarian. And then lastly, with service, city constructed kiosks, right? So what the city can do, what the city has done in other industries and verticals, when you go to parks, you see kiosks that provide coffee, provide food. Shake Shack was famously in a New York City, basically concession kiosk. I don't see why we can't be building kiosks like those along major cycling routes even today. So when you look at the greenways, for example, why can't the city of New York build a medium-sized kiosk, rent that kiosk to a local bike shop, and say, look, if you're going to have the citywide contract for 5 or 6 kiosks, then you need to be open during these hours, charge these prices, provide these services. It would be a win for the bike shop because they would be able to rent retail space at a far lower price than they could on the street. It'd be a win for cyclists who would have a network of citywide service centers that would have standardized hours, standardized services, standardized pricing. And it would be a win for the city because you're finding a way to increase mode share, which is ostensibly the goal, and you're activating unused spaces. And then lastly, when we think about our plan, how we're going to get to this 25, 30% mode share, we really need to kind of start from scratch. I think right now, New York City had a great master plan for bikes in 2007. It's 2020. The city has changed a lot. So we have to start with, like any business or political campaign starts, you got to start with polls and focus groups. We have to talk to New Yorkers, both New Yorkers that ride and New Yorkers that don't ride. And in between those, New Yorkers who ride but want to ride more. And understand from every race and creed and class how folks are relating to this ecosystem and what we can do to provide them with more access and a system, an experience that is more rewarding. Use that feedback to generate the next master plan. And so that's my presentation. I look forward to questions and comments and to the discussion ahead.
All right, thanks, Shabazz. And if you let's see, stop sharing. Okay. There are a couple questions that were posed in the chat. I'm going to take one of them and just kind of weave it into something that your great presentation stimulated. A thought that stimulated in me was just, the bike boom. And that was your first slide. It's going on amidst this incredible economic dislocation due to the pandemic, which create all of these opportunities. I mean, we see businesses closing around us. So many businesses that were part of the fabric of our daily lives are closing, can't make it. We try to support them. And, Judd had said, it's so hard to find a bike. Like, it's so hard to find bikes, even that there's such a demand for them. What's your take on why the city would not look at this as an opportunity during this economic dislocation to say, hey, people are opting for bikes for transportation for all the reasons we know that you've talked about.
Yeah.
And we're gonna facilitate that and support that the way, we always think of cities as trying to stimulate local economic activity, not just because they want to make the goods and services of that activity available, but because it obviously generates tax revenue for the city, it generates vitality, it generates interest. Why would the current administration, why aren't they listening when they say we need another, where are the rest of the Unipods for downtown Manhattan?
So I'm reading a book now called Subway, and it's about, you can probably guess the history of the subway in New York City. And it is amazing to me when we talk about the lack of transportation services that, or capital projects that we've seen in New York, how much got done with way less so long ago. So, back in the day, back in 1904, 1900, all the challenges we face today were there, but 10 times greater, right? Technology wasn't nearly as advanced. There was much more corruption. There was just as much NIMBYism as there is today, if not more. The corporate interests were as protracted, but we found a way to get it done. I think looking at cycling here in New York, there are two problems. Foremost, we don't have an attitude that lends itself well to any transportation development in New York City, right? It doesn't look at cycling. Look at the subway. Look at busways, for example. We built 14th Street, so quote unquote built. We pat ourselves in the back when we talk about building a 4-block long busway down J Street in Brooklyn, right? And the MTA asked for 60 miles of busway. We do maybe 5 miles of busway. So it's a systemic problem. I think bikes are a part of that, where we don't really, we haven't acclimated ourselves into a generation to do big, bold, visionary things. It is a problem with this administration for sure. It's not solely limited to this administration. In cities across the country, we're seeing an institutional reticence to moving swiftly and boldly. I think the next administration has an opportunity to think holistically about bikes, pedestrianism, and transit in a way that no administration that I can remember has had, or anywhere in the country has had. Look, I think even in today's environment, great things are possible. In LA, it was illegal to build a subway until 2005, right? It was literally against the law, right? That's how entrenched the opposition was to doing projects there. Now LA is leading the charge in building new subways and new transportation projects. So here in New York, look what's happened in Paris and what's happening in London, and the surge in popularity we're seeing on bikes, and the surge in popularity we're seeing with open streets. I think there's a political moment where people actually are open and interested in bike infrastructure. I just think we have to find, an administration that's willing to seize that moment and then empower them. A lot of this is on them, but it's also on the city council. It's also on the media, the fourth estate. Give them the impetus to think big, think systemically, do big things. Right now, we've lacked that. And some of it, to be clear, is also just the fact that we have a mayor who doesn't seem to be interested in doing anything, any big things. We spent $600 million in ferries. I can make you a long list of things that we could have done with $600 million that would have probably been, more effective. But it became clear at that moment that we weren't looking to think big in New York City. We're looking to think, little. Yep.
Ouch. Okay, I can't disagree. Another question that was posed by Judd, and then there was one in the Q&A, but the issue of whether Citibank sponsors a service like Citibike as a straight up business proposition and it's worth every penny they pay, or is this some sort of a philanthropic endeavor by Citibank? And for full disclosure, I used to represent Citibike, not for a few years now since their Lyft acquisition, but You know, my impression was always that it was a huge win for Citibank. It was a very smart investment. The branding of their bikes, which are everywhere, they're called City Bikes. They'll always be called City Bikes, probably, no matter who the sponsor is. Was just a really smart marketing decision and a good ad buy. But I and Judd both are wondering if you agree.
I think, look, when you talk to the people at Citi, it's one of the most valuable advertising assets. It started out, as many of these sponsorships do, as a favor to the city. It was, the city, Jeanette Sadi-Khan is not shy about sharing that the city basically called up, the city called up Citi and said, hey, we're doing this thing. Can you help us out? And it was a little risky at the time because, folks weren't sure if how this thing would turn out. The New York Daily News and the Post were, talking about carnage in the streets. And so people were like, oh, I don't know, right? And they stepped up and did it. And two things became clear right away. Foremost, we learned that it was extremely popular, and that it was something that, one second. It was a marketing coup for Citi, and that they didn't pay anything for it. In fact, Alta basically went bankrupt because Citi didn't pay enough. It was considered the marketing steal of a century. When you talk to the guys at Citi, and get some drinks in them, they'll tell you that when you look across their portfolio of assets, they've got Citi Field, they've got Citi Bike, they've got a few other branding assets that they kind of sponsor. Citi Bike is their crown jewel. It's by far the most valuable thing they have, and not just because of the sponsorship, it's also because they have the advertising panels on the assets themselves. People often forget that those signs include straight up Citi advertisements that are like talking about 5% cash back or whatever. So it's really something that's turned into
Free toaster.
Exactly. So they love it. Do I think that it's do I think it started as a charitable proposition? Sure. I think that it was a real risk that Citi took to step forward and to do this, that required them to kind of double bottom line it. I think now is a little bit of a different kind of proposition. I think they're really excited about it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's largely right. I think cities should understand that sponsorship and some advertising can get brands excited. It makes a lot of sense to market those away. I think that's what's happened here.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you've said. And you said something else that really struck me. I thought it was a very kind of a good point that we don't hear often enough, and I'm not sure I've heard articulated as well before. The idea that good design inspires public respect and stewardship of public infrastructure. Good design, good maintenance, and of course that's true, and we all know and believe that's true because that's how we feel. And at the same time, there's this meme out there of a well-designed, novelly designed urban infrastructure is about gentrification. When you start seeing the Citi Bike stand in your neighborhood, that's not for you. That's for the people they're going to move you out to make way for. And do you hear that? Do you hear that bike infrastructure, for the sake of argument, even Unipod is just like the leading wave of gentrification?
Yeah, you know what?
You already talked about like the demographic participation and what you've done. So I mean, it's just the answer's there.
So,
but anyway,
look, the answer is yes. People occasionally say. One person who's now a friend, and we were able to have a nice conversation with her. Was called it a gentrification box, and another person, who I think was just on Twitter and was trolling and said, oh, you're taking money away from kids in public school. And it wasn't. But look, when you help people understand a few things, they 99.99% of the companies I've been in, people understand why that is a bankrupt train of thought. First, it's free. It's open to everybody. It's free to use. We're not charging, city bike-like prices. We're not charging private garage prices. It's relatively egalitarian from that perspective. And I think the results bear those out. When you look at why our user base is as diverse as it is, then it's something that I think becomes relatively clear. I'm going to share in the chat right now, actually. I don't know if you saw this, Steve, but we just give me 1 second. We recently filmed a series called Uni Perspectives. It features, members of the community, a lot of whom are our members, actually not just members of the community, talking about how they want more. And one of the perspectives that got the most amount of feedback was Kawan's. Kawan, I'll just share his story. Kawan was in a shelter in Manhattan, in Chinatown. He commutes from Chinatown to Atlantic Terminal to the pod every morning because he needs his bike to make deliveries for Grubhub, and he can't keep his bike in the shelter. And for him, it being free allows him to save up more money to move up the shelter. For him, it's so important that he's willing to take the subway every day, 6 or 7 stops down to downtown Brooklyn just for that. So, I think when people say, "Oh, this is a gentrification tool," it doesn't comport with reality. You say, look, there are 50,000 mostly Black, brown, and Asian folks who are delivering for restaurants that rely on safe bike lanes and bike parking and bike infrastructure. What about them? When you go to Black communities, now you see Black kids, freelancing for Postmates. What about them? When you say, hey, this person, all they've got is a bike to get around. What about them, right? It's almost sometimes angering when I hear that, because it's like you're erasing all of those people that exist. It's quite possible here in New York that a majority of cyclists are Black and brown, or Black, brown, and Asian, I should say. And for people to insinuate that because we have safe infrastructure for bikes, that's gentrification, is incomprehensible. I will say that what is gentrification infrastructure typically are parking garages. What is gentrification infrastructure are driving lanes, are car facilities, because we know in New York City, if you commute to work via vehicle, you tend to make a lot more than folks who commute by bike and folks who commute by public transportation. The average person, I believe, who commutes to Manhattan in a car is making like $85,000 a year. That's what we should be looking at and saying, okay, if we really want to make an egalitarian society, let's think holistically about how we can recalibrate our on-street space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen. And since there's just a minute left in our presentation, I do have to ask you, does the use of transparent materials, which I agree with you, has so many pluses associated with the Unipod construction, but does it make it easier to break into an Unipod? Have you ever had break-ins, or are they secure?
Yeah. We've never had a break-in. We've had one bike. So we've had one bike stolen. We've had no break-ins. I can tell you a bit about how this happened in a second. And we do provide insurance to the bikes inside. So if your bike does get stolen, we cover the depreciated value of the bike. Um, so um, I tell people off the bat, we're not Fort Knox. We don't want to be Fort Knox. We want to be something that's relatively secure. Like if you take your bike and put it in an uni, it's 99.9% less likely to be stolen than leaving it on the street, right? Now, that doesn't mean that it's never going to be stolen. It just means it's probably not going to be stolen. You know, you have to think about, so people know their bike's in there already. They can see it, they know their bike's in there. I don't think that it, that having to be transparent is a negative thing. I think it's a positive thing, because if someone is going to perform an illicit activity like stealing a bike, they know they're going to be seen, right? We have this impression, you think about garages, for example, that it's because it's hidden away, it's safer. That's actually often not true when it comes to bike theft. You know, when you talk to bike
New York in general.
yeah, they'll say like, look, I prefer to side streets to steal bikes, because I can steal a bike. I don't want to steal a bike on Broadway. I'll steal a bike on, on 51st Street, like in the corner, right? So having it be out in the open and very visible makes everyone safer. We did, the biggest point of security risk is in the sign-up process. So we have to make sure that people aren't signing up to come in and steal bikes, right? So we did have that happen once. That was in the summer. We had someone who signed up, and they actually raised some red flags at the get-go. And we did get in contact with them, and we did ask them for an ID, to verify their identity. They shared their ID. It was a fake ID. The next day they came in and stole a bike. And it was not an uni kind of day, because it was a $6,500 bike. But they came in, we had them on camera. It was like, that's not a 27-year-old Jamaican guy. That guy is not, that's a white guy, right? And we realized right away what had happened. Look, it was a tough conversation with Bahati, who was the user that had his bike stolen. He's still a user. We did give him a check for $2,500. Obviously less than his new track cost, but also much more than he would have gotten on the street. We did file a police report with him. We spent the afternoon with him on the phone. And I think this is the exception that proves the rule. When we talk about biking in New York City, it's like the Wild West for lots of people, right? Where you are on your own. And even if I can't give you back your bike, even if I can't, catch the guys who did it, I can hold your hand and help you feel like you're not tackling this space alone. And that's what we do, by the way, in every other transportation mode. If you, if your purse drops in the subway tracks, there's someone to call, right? If your train gets stuck, there's someone to call. If your car crashes, there's someone to call, right? If when you have your bike stolen, there's usually no one to call. When you've got a flat, there's no one to call. So even that tough circumstance, talking to someone, saying, hey, here's the video, so they can actually see it happen. Saying, hey, look, we'll file a police report with you. We've launched an investigation. This is what happened. We're so sorry. We find even that, has a lot of efficacy. And users, even though they understand that their bike is gone, will be very happy knowing that they're part of a system that is competent and helps protect their property.
That's great, and that's something that I think can help. I mean, a lot of the reasons you see the carcasses, the frames of bikes left around with all the components ripped off is when people come out and they want to get back on their bike and they see that it's unrideable because the wheels or the seat or whatever else was taken. They just leave it there, and then
right.
it turns into a blight. It turns into a lost parking space for other people who have functional bikes.
Right.
It's just, as you say, it's the symbol of a broken heart or broken dreams of what urban transportation could be. Thanks for coming and sketching out what that dream could look like if we did it right, if we look to other peer world cities. I just can't believe how badly we're muffing it, but I'm glad to know that there are people taking, a smart, incisive, design-informed perspective on these economic needs and helping us think about, the importance of utility cycling in the city since the pandemic, since before the pandemic, as a complement to all the other different types of cycling. Your economic perspective on who is actually cycling, and just thinking about it by the raw numbers instead of tribally, the way many cyclists do. I'm a commuter, or I'm a pedal cyclist. I don't like e-bikes. I don't like scooters. I'm a road cyclist. I don't commute because, the bike lanes are death traps, whatever it is. I mean, it's very refreshing and helpful to hear you lay out exactly what is going on, and it helps give a fresh perspective. So, thank you so much, and seeing you around.
Thanks so much, everybody. Feel free to email me. I'll leave my email address in the thread if anyone wants to shoot me an email.
In fact, why don't you just say your email as well, and your Twitter handle for those on Twitter. I am.
My email address is Shabazz at oonpod, oonpod.com. My Twitter is just Shabazz Stewart. I'll put my Twitter handle. And that's also the same for Instagram and for Facebook.
It's in the chat. So thanks a lot, Shabazz. And as I say, I'll see you around. Thanks for taking the time.
See you around. Thanks so much, Steve.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.